You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, and welcome to another episode of SLA Insights. My name is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I'm continuing to present some ideas for vocabulary learning, some specific classroom-oriented activities that students can engage in to help learn and reinforce vocabulary. In previous episodes, I've talked about flashcards, imaging and instantiation, the keyword technique, recycled words procedure. And in this episode, in the last of this series of ideas for vocabulary learning, I'm going to talk about retelling a story as a means of vocabulary learning and retention. This type of instruction is indirect vocabulary learning in a meaningful context. So let me unpack that just a little bit. First of all, the indirect learning, as I've talked about in previous episodes, is where you're not providing direct instruction. You're not giving definitions and glosses for the vocabulary words. Instead, the meaning is learned from context. And the meaningful context part of that, again, indirect vocabulary learning in a meaningful context, is where the learner is focused on the meaning of the story that's being communicated. So the focus is comprehension. So Nation, kind of the vocabulary guru here of learning vocabulary in a second language, he explains the rationale behind this type of activity. He says, and this is a quote, "From a vocabulary learning point of view, the text provides new vocabulary and a context to help understand the vocabulary, and the retelling gives the learners the chance to productively retrieve the vocabulary and ideally make creative use of it." End of the quote. So these are all factors that promote vocabulary learning and retention. So we talk about the procedure now, how you do this. The basic premise is just that the students will read a text and then retell that story to someone else. But there are many possible variations on this particular activity. Now, keep in mind, because they're going to be reading a story, it's going to assume that a student is probably not first semester, probably not a beginner, but it can be done with earlier language students all the way up through advanced. What you want to do as a teacher is to choose a text and or prepare the text. And this may be the most challenging part of this particular activity in terms of preparation for the instructor. Because, as I've mentioned multiple times now in this podcast series, the students need to know at least 95 to 98% of the running words in a text in order to be able to comprehend it. And so the instructor needs to make sure that the story that the students are reading meets that criteria. They need to be able to know at least 95 to 98% of the words. Now, there are not many, if any at all, authentic ancient texts that are going to fit that criteria, even for a second-year student. So there's going to be some modification necessary. And I've talked in previous episodes about how you can do that in terms of simplifying the text, providing visual clues, creating a diglot weave. Again, multiple ways of creating a simplified text, but you're probably going to have to modify that text in order for it to be comprehensible for the students at your level. But for this particular activity, in the process of modifying it, the instructor has the opportunity to embed some specific target vocabulary items. These can be new words, brand new words, but they may be, and my preference in this type of activity would be to use words that have already been encountered but need deeper learning and need to be encountered in context to learn how they're used, the collocations, the syntax of using this particular vocabulary item. So you're going to start by preparing the text, and then After that, especially if you're going to be using brand new words, you may want to pre-teach some of the vocabulary items. And this would involve direct instruction, where you give them a list of vocabulary words with a gloss or a meaning. You talk about the words, you talk about how they might function in a text. This would be the pre-teaching stage. So once you've done preparing the text, done any pre-teaching that you're going to, and again, this is one possible variation on this activity, then the students are ready to read the text and retell it in the second language. So if it's a Hebrew text, read the Hebrew text, and then they're going to retell it in Hebrew. Now, the least threatening approach, and as I said, there are multiple variations on how you can do it. The least threatening is that the students work in pairs. And so they only have an audience of one as they're doing the retelling, and then they get to switch roles. So the speaker then becomes the listener in the second time around with the other student. And so it becomes, again, a lot less threatening because they only have one person to talk to. They know that other person is going to take a turn to repeat it to them. However, this activity could be done where the student retells the story to the instructor or to a group of students, 2, 3, 4, even the whole class, depending on how you want to run it. So again, multiple variations of how you do this. A few other possible variations on this particular activity. One is that the partners, if you're using pairs, the partners each receive a different text. So they're not going to be retelling the same text to each other. They each get a unique text. And this makes it more interesting. It also makes it more necessary for clear, comprehensible communication. So they don't know what the other student is going to be telling them. They haven't read their text. And so it's going to be even more important that the communication be clear back and forth to each other. Another variation on this particular activity is you could provide a time limit on the retelling. So they've read the story and then say you get 3 minutes to retell it to your partner. And so it gives more of a focus, keeps the activity from taking up the whole class time, but it also encourages them to get in what they want to say and to do it concisely. There's a similar variation on this particular activity that's called the 4-3-2 activity. And this is something that has been advocated by Zhang and Perfetti. They have an article called Fluency Training in the ESL Classroom, an Experimental Study of Fluency Development and Proceduralization. The idea behind this 4-3-2 activity is that the students tell their story 3 different times in a row. First time they get 4 minutes to say it. Second time they get 3 minutes. And the third time they get 2 minutes to talk. And so each time they get practice at saying it and saying it again and doing it better and more fluently each time, and offers opportunity for more fluent retrieval of the target vocabulary items. And as they use them and retrieve them, not just passively in recognizing them in a text, but using them to communicate something, it's going to lay deeper and more memory traces for them to recover that memory. And then a final variation on this activity is to provide the listening student, the one who's listening to the retelling of the story, to provide that person with a list of questions, preferably in the target language, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, whatever it is you're using. And this way, the retelling becomes more like an interview. So the student can ask, well, who did what? Or what's the main point of the story? Or how does the plot work? Or, some things that they're prepared to ask the student who's doing the retelling to keep them focused, to help make the process go a little more smoothly. And the teacher, if they're creating the questions, can design them in such a way to elicit the target vocabulary items that they're trying to draw out and practice in this particular text or assignment. So today has been covering the retelling a story for the purpose of vocabulary learning and retention. In the next episode, to kind of wrap up this unit on vocabulary, I want to talk about some recent publications that have come out focusing specifically on vocabulary learning for Biblical Hebrew. There are not too many articles or dissertations that are coming out, but there are more all the time on second language acquisition and the learning of biblical languages. So I want to draw your attention to those, and that'll be in next week's episode. I hope you can join me. In the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.